Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of Sales Express in English, because today we have a very special guest that's a French native that does not yet speak fluent German.
Yes, it's getting there.
Let me briefly introduce you. Today it really grand switching to English because I thought that with your background, Ambre, and your experience, it really warrants a podcast episode. But let me give you some background. You meaning everyone listening. You were most recently at Parloa, where you helped build the sales enablement as head of. Before that, you were at Überall, 5 years in different enablement positions. And the last one was as senior manager for the global enablement. And you just recently founded Scaling Edge, which in my words, it's a go-to-market enablement consultancy / coaching business. So extremely interesting. But now with your angle that you bring to the table today, you're the first one that has actually worked in enablement. Share, please, for what challenge are you here today?
Yeah, sure. And thanks a lot for the introduction, Dominic. The most common challenge that I have, especially with sales coaching, you have this typical situation where you have a sales team and the head of sales or VP or director has very little time for coaching. So what happens is that the reps are very hungry for feedback, but the lead is constantly firefighting. And so as a result of that, this person would join the sales call to actually close the deal himself or do it himself because it's faster and somehow easier instead of teaching the reps how to do it.
Nodding and smiling, because when we talk to sales leaders of different seniorities, it's always the first reaction is, yeah, but we train. In reality, it just doesn't happen. And it's, hey, we don't have the time, we don't have the bandwidth. It's part of their job description, right? Making your people better should be utmost priority. But now between us, what do you think, Unfiltered? Why just does it not happen in a day-to-day?
I feel a part of it is, as I said, easier and faster to just do it yourself. Right? Try to think of anything you're trying to teach anyone, whether it's sales or not sales, any skill.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a lot of time to explain exactly how to do something and to allow the person to think and to reflect of how they performed in a specific task or something like this. While I said a sales call and closing the deal yourself might be faster.
Yeah.
I think there's a part of just habit, but also bandwidth, and maybe lack of understanding and experience when it comes to coaching. So my perspective, it's always the same topic, right? Like it's not scalable. There's this saying I always use when I try to convince sales managers that they need to start coaching is give someone a fish and you feed them for the day, but teach someone how to fish and then you feed them for a lifetime, right? So that's the idea.
I mean, I had a mentor in the US who always said, Dominic, you yourself, you're unscalable, right? We all have a ceiling. We are only scalable so much. So you need to make your team scalable, make yourself obsolete. And I think it's partly because leadership hasn't been trained ever in how to give feedback or coaching, or has never been trained in sales. And maybe they shy away from, hey, how am I doing it besides just doing it intuitively? If it's not working with external agencies, for example, like high-rise training in that context, how do you go about it internally?
I think there's definitely many different approaches. And my role in there as enablement is really to embed coaching moments within the day-to-day, like within the team rhythm. And the first thing that I think about when it comes to coaching is it's not magic, it's actually structure. And again, this is a bit of the mystery around coaching. We need to demystify it and really define what it is. So in reality, coaching really is structured conversation around specific behaviors. How do you observe what you notice in the behaviors? Why would you try differently? How can you support, and how much time it takes to do that? It's more of an ongoing effort than just a one-off inspirational talk, as said. That's definitely one part of it. And then what comes with it is really a question of not over-engineering it. One feedback that I often hear from sales leads, and which makes sense, there's so many meetings, so many calls, internal calls between deal reviews and forecasting and things like that. So you don't want coaching to be an additional 1 hour. So for me, it's about not trying to over-engineer the coaching approach, but say, okay, let's incorporate coaching behaviors within those existing calls and make it easy to execute on, instead of trying to make something that will just add more work on the table of the sales managers.
Let's say low friction or low barrier, right, to start coaching. But go back to one specific example that you faced.
And in that case, having some, I was the enablement person, so of course the person, we had this extra resource to work on this. The first thing we did was looking at the bandwidth of the coach, of the managers, sorry. So looking at the calendars, what are they during the week? What are those weekly team meetings and one-on-ones and so they are doing, and see how we can incorporate small coaching moments within this. So we created this sort of, I want to say, coaching governance almost, right? Saying like, okay, as a team lead or head of or VP, this is what coaching means, what we expect you to deliver, and this is where you can incorporate in your day-to-day. It took some effort, also some things, because one of the things we realized that, for example, head of that we're doing tasks that they shouldn't be doing. Right? So it's taking over some other tasks. It takes time for moving a lot of quotes that I didn't have to approve. So we had a deal desk person in place, but there was just not communication between the teams. So we removed some of those responsibilities that were taking too much time and started by adding, for example, 5 minutes coaching in the deal review, or just shifting the way to address it. So instead of asking as a manager, okay, what's the next step? Maybe looking to ask something in the sense of, what option do you see? What's your hypothesis on this deal, right? So just moving away from this very, what's the next step? Why you didn't do this? What is wrong? What is right in your deal? But more thinking, helping the rep to reflect on how they're conducting the deal. And so it's very small steps, but that's exactly what helps to build this coaching culture over time.
Let's help demystify what is coaching in that context for those listening in that might need the mystification. What do we mean when we say coaching?
For me, coaching is really reinforcing behaviors, the right behaviors, right? So it's not a training. There's a big difference between training and coaching from my perspective. Training is sharing information, saying this is how you should do it. And then coaching is reinforcing what good looks like. And reinforcing is usually done with someone from that has more authority in the relationship, in the work relationship. So that's often why it goes with the managers and not a random external coach coming in. And reinforcing what is expected from this person, ensuring that not only they've got the training, but they are learning from it. And it's a learning curve happening, right? It's a question of behaviors.
In layman terms, right? Coaching is you ask smart questions, you make them think, tap into their brain power, right? To foster, let's say, accountability as well. And the other one, training, is knowledge transfer. And let's go back to what you said, right? You said your first step was, in that case, clear up the manager's calendars. Let's say, I make it sound easier than it is. And then embed little, let's say, micro coaching units into the touch points they have. Now, what's the how? What are coaching techniques that work, or that everyone listening in can adopt?
Yeah, I think for me, it's the changing the type of questions asked and the terminologies and vocabulary used, right? So you just mentioned also like reflective question. Instead of being very directive in terms what's the next step, if you think of what's your hypothesis there, you put the responsibility and the thinking part on the other person. So this is one part of the coaching approach, is really to change the way you ask questions. And you don't do it yourself. That's the important part. Right? It's not bringing the answers yourself as a manager, saying you should have done this like this. No, instead maybe ask, what would you have done differently now that you listen to your call, or that now that the deal is still in that specific step? I think that's part of it. So the way you ask the questions, I believe there's a big part also that is psychological safety. So the question of reps feeling that they can actually ask the questions they need to ask, and also give wrong answers. And it's okay to just ask those questions, do mistakes, and the manager is here to guide them through it and not be punished for. Of course, this comes in a specific scope. Right? If someone doesn't perform at all, at some point there's something wrong, but just in general. I don't want to also go into like too sophisticated coaching approach, because that's really not the topic here. Training someone to become a coach, like a professional coach, but just understanding how anyone as a manager can just adjust the way they speak, the way they perform their deal reviews and ones and the forecasting calls, to make it coaching moments instead of trying to just avoid it and push it away and think that it's going to get better with time.
Did it work in the case where you came in and you did it?
Yes. So it does take time. That's one big disclaimer. It's not something that happened overnight, especially because here we're talking about small moments. So of course, 5 minutes a week doesn't make a difference in 1 month, right? Like it takes some time to build up. But I would say after the first couple of months, there was at the beginning a bit of a dip in the adoptions. Managers were doing it, where it was a setup with multiple managers. So they were all doing it and then they stopped doing it. So we had to reinforce normal behavior, right? Like adoption is not there. And then the second round of reinforcement, knowing that we didn't change the process. It was not a dip of adoption because something was wrong. We didn't say let's change everything and start again. Just let's start with the same thing one more time. What we've seen is that first of all, there was more and more coaching happening, but then it was getting to the point where they were themselves asking for a dedicated session. And I was really, really surprised when I had the sales managers coming to me saying, hey, could we actually schedule something that is dedicated to team coaching? In our
You mean the managers wanting more intel, more guidance on how to be a better coach?
Not I wanted to do more of it because
Okay.
the impact of it, meaning that there was more consistency in the way the deals were being closed and also a better relationship with their reps. And so eventually they asked, like, can we do some group coaching? So we had like a deal review call and a deal coaching call, which I was a bit concerned about at the beginning because of the amount of time, I did in the calendar. Turned out it worked really well because you had the deal review, which was more on the forecast side of things and very operational and steps driven. But then you had a group deal coaching call where it was really reps coming in and exchanging ideas. And eventually the managers even ended up stepping back a bit because it just happened that it became part of the team culture to do this coaching thing. This was over, I would say, at least 6 to 9 months until you get to this point.
Now, when we talk to, and it happens quite a bit, enablement teams at growing tech companies that especially now say, hey, part of our priority is where we can't hire via headcount, make our existing reps better. And we have introduced an initiative, which means turn our managers into better coaches. Really, we have 3-4 cases where enablement is tasked with coaching their managers or the sales managers to be better coaches. How do you train sales managers or coach sales managers to be better, to introduce coaching? So meaning, did you give them specific examples? Did you schedule multiple sessions? Did you do call reviews with like on one-on-one state? Because it usually the where the rubber meets the road is checking on actual implementation. So how do you go about it? How do you train them and how do you make sure that it does get implemented?
I want to say all of it, everything that you described, because again, that's how you learn. That you don't learn by one training or one session.
Amen.
So the first approach to any sort of learning, but especially in the case of teaching sales managers how to coach better, first of all, setting the right expectations. Everyone has different understanding and definition of coaching and training and enablement. Very often what I would see is that they would all have a different understanding of what coaching is. And that's often also where you have the question, but I thought enablement would do coaching. They have a senior A in the team that should do the coaching. And it sounds like then you start to point fingers of who should coach. So setting the expectation is the very first step. And once there's the expectation, no one wants to talk about, but it's really key to the success is documentation. It has to be written down. Everyone has access to it. And you can always refer to it at any point of time. Because I've seen also many times you agree on something and then it's one Slack somewhere that was in for some time and then disappeared.
So true.
Document it, make sure everyone has access, whether it's in your Notion or whatever internal wiki. And then you go into the training. And the training is, again, in terms of sharing those best practices. I have a preference for hiring someone external for that, because I've seen just with experience that set a specific topic, and especially when it comes to leadership training, gets better adopted when it's with an external professional. If there's no resources, also use whatever resources you have internally, whoever has a bit more experience in coaching in general to help put together a training and keep track on it. And I said, it will do because adoption, especially in those fast-paced environments, is never linear because there's too many things happening, because sometimes if you don't practice one skill, you will kind of forget about it. So it will dip, and it doesn't mean that it shouldn't happen. It doesn't mean that it's bad. just means that sometimes it's worth pushing a bit more to see. And so that would be the third step, would be the fourth step, then the coaching with the fourth step, the ongoing reinforcement. And if it still, again, like requires additional external coaching, I would really have a preference for that there. Also in terms of the reinforcement, to ensure that it's not just a one-off information then never used.
In that case, somebody external would come in and train manager leadership. Hey, here's how you do coaching, right? That enablement is probably having the role, making sure it does get done. Right? You coordinate, you orchestrate, but you find the enabler, which is then maybe an external agency or a trainer or consultant that does it, right?
Exactly. I've done both of those options, either doing it in-house or hiring someone externally. Like I said, it's more of a personal preference based on my experience. Better to have someone externally. If needed, enablement can also support that. But I also do believe that enablement is not here to just train on every single skill, but to ensure that those skills are actually existing within the team.
And I mean, it would require that enablement itself is trained in coaching, knows how to do coaching, right? And if that's not the case, you have an authority issue. If, like in your case, you are, how would you internally, if there was no budget externally to train on an external authority, or would you train leadership really hands-on? How would you do that?
When I had to do it myself internally, I put together the training myself. At the time, ChatGPT was not as big.
Yeah.
Now I would say it's slightly easier. But putting the training yourself based on for me, what I was focusing on is adult learning theories. So I kind of removed the sales part of it at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you train adults to learn a new skill? Looking into, how much percentage is into the training itself, the coaching, the practice, and all of that.
Yes.
So I put together the training, following the skills that I wanted them to learn, and then executed this training. Of course, I also have a preference when it comes to training, kind of excited around it. So not just a 1 hour video call, but because it was leadership, we took 2-3 hours workshop. There was a bit of ice breaking at the beginning, going through the specific skills, trying to gamify it, and then agreeing on how we're going to track it in the long run. And then in the next couple of weeks after the training, I was, as you mentioned earlier, joining the calls, going with them to the call recordings, just to start, for example, right?
Nice.
So the recordings of calls from the reps, and saying, okay, so what do you identify in terms of trends? What type of question would you like to ask to your reps? What you see, again, like at the first reaction of the managers, especially if they're not used to it, or they should have done this differently, this is bad, or this is good. And it gets very, black and white situation. And so it was a question showing them that it's not so much about judgment and saying this is bad, this is wrong, but just looking into, again, what is the expectations for the reps? How do we expect them to conduct the call? What they did differently to those expectations, and how do we bring them to realize that themselves, right? Instead of always being very directive. And then did that over a few weeks so that it was being used and that the teams were following it.
For training, it needs to happen over time. Even managers, they need the continuous reminders. They need to see what best practice is. You need to give feedback on how they actually implemented it, and then it needs to be constant in their day-to-day, right? Just the same. And by the way, for everyone that's interested in effective learning systems, right, there was a 70-20-10 learning method saying that 10% comes from impulses, theory, like workshops. That's why they're so ineffective. Usually, if you do just that, people forget 70% within a week. 20% is social learning, so peer-to-peer, hearing it from others, listening in on calls, and 70% is getting feedback on your day-to-day practice. So you implement, but you need to give them feedback. Otherwise, they don't know what the ideal outcome, the ideal best practice is.
Exactly. And one good thing of doing this with the managers and taking them through this, they also then learn by doing it themselves, so they see how they can do it with their reps.
Perfect.
Some of them never had this experience of having this type of approach, and so they realize, again, what good looks like and how they can themselves deliver it better.
Beautiful. But now we've almost come to an end. Any resource that you can recommend?
There's a bunch of different articles. I'm going to do a bit of self-promotion. Then I did write a few articles as part of my newsletter called Scaling Smarter about exactly this coaching, and especially when it comes to manager enablement and how key it is to any sales team success. So it's not only about enabling the reps, but also enabling the managers. And I also wrote a enablement handbook that kind of highlights some very clear steps, very actionable. So it's not a very long one, but it's really about the easy to follow steps that you can put in place right now.
Then we'll share that, a link to that, in the show notes. And also saying that we're very happy that you are the latest member to our trainer or coach crew. That you are now exactly on board at Harvest Training for that use case, helping sales enablement professionalize, enable their internal go-to-market teams. Thanks for listening in. Thanks for joining.
Thanks a lot.
And to everyone else, reach out to us on LinkedIn. That's probably the best channel. Have a great rest of your day and tune in soon again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.